Well, welcome everybody to another 1350 interview. And today I'm joined by Martyn. Now, I know Martyn a little bit. I grew up in the church where he's a lay licensed minister. I don't know if that's a term you use, but that's the Durham term anyway, because I know reader and licensed minister and all those things have changed in recent years. But Martyn, do you want to introduce yourself? What is it that you do? What's your background? Your sort of TV speaking roles and author roles. What makes you you?
Well, as you say, I am what we call in Salisbury Diocese, down in the west of England, a licensed lay minister, but otherwise known as a reader within the Church of England. And I'm part of the leadership team of my church that meets in Trowbridge. So for 35 years, I taught secondary school history at various comprehensives, and I was variously head of history and head of humanities. And towards the end of my teaching career, I was in charge of spiritual, moral, social, and cultural development at a large comprehensive school. So that was my paid employment. During that time, I was also getting into writing. So I've always been very interested in writing and creative writing, but I got involved in school textbook writing. So I wrote quite a lot of history textbooks for various publishers, Heinemann, Pearson, Collins, Hodder & Stoughton, and so on. Because of the nature of being a secondary school teacher, where it might be like Romans period 1 on a Friday and Stalin's terror last thing on a Friday, but with a different year group, year 7 in the morning, upper 6th in the afternoon, you do become quite adept at jumping from period to period. So my history textbooks cover a whole range of stuff from the Roman Empire through to Hitler's Germany and Stalin's Russia, and the Tudors are in between there as well, and Native Americans, and a whole range of other areas that I wrote for the secondary school curriculum. Some of them are still being used in schools, some of them are a bit out of print now. But towards the end of my time in teaching, actually retired in 2016, I got quite interested in writing books for the interested general reader. So not academic books in that sense, and not textbooks, but books that somebody might say, I've got an interest in this particular period of history, but I'm a busy person. I'd like somebody else to have done all the reading for me because, you can't do everything in life. But it's all fully footnoted. So somebody could read it, get interested in it, and could chase up the footnotes if they wanted to take it further. So written for the general adult reader. So towards the end of my time as a history teacher, I was beginning to write books for the general reader, and I retired in 2016. And since then, I have done quite a lot of writing on a whole range of subjects. I've written a book on the Soviet secret police. I've written a book called Trump and the Puritans, looking at why US evangelicals support Trump. I co-wrote that with somebody else. I have written books also on eschatology, one called The End Times Again, ? And one called Apocalyptic Politics, looking at end times beliefs within Christianity, and the second one of those in the Abrahamic religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And most recently, I've written a book called American Vikings, How the Norse Sailed into the Lands and Imaginations of America. And in this time, I've got particularly interested in what you might call deep stories, the way by which people use, sometimes abuse, the past in order to explain themselves and their society, say something about who they are and what they're about. And every nation has its deep stories. It has ways in which it reaches into its past to try to explain itself. So that's something I've got particularly interested in. I wrote a book on the Mayflower, obviously a big issue within the American cultural DNA. I looked at Vikings' journeys to America, which certainly happened in the 11th century, but also how that then contributed towards a lot of later US culture and politics. They're still very big in America today, including in some very alarming areas of American turbulent politics at the moment. But as I say, I was also very interested in the way in which people draw on end times beliefs and try to interpret them and understand them and try to use those to explain what's going on in the world today. So a whole range of areas. So that's partly my way of explaining why I've written about so many different areas, because as a teacher, you teach tons of different stuff and you get an interest in all sorts of stuff. But recently, I've been particularly interested in this concept of deep stories. Alongside that, I am a licensed lay minister in the Church of England. So every month I'm normally preaching once, maybe twice a month at my local church, and I'm a small group leader as well. So it keeps me busy and keeps me off the streets.
Brilliant. Well, I suppose we're going to pick up on the Vikings at some point because, well, we couldn't talk about the northeast of England without talking about the Viking invasions and what that did to the church. We all know the stories of Lindisfarne and how they came and they destroyed and set up their own camps, and how that spread through, and how Cuthbert had to move. The monks moved his body because of they were worried about Vikings and all those sorts of things, and the effect that all of that had on Monk Wearmouth. But I wonder if we start. Maybe if I could ask you, the ancient kings, the ones who kind of gave the land for these monasteries, thinking in our area particularly, but maybe sort of broader across the country, did they have a particular goal in mind when they gave the lands to these monasteries? Or might there have been a bit of self-interest involved along the way?
What I should have said earlier is another area I am particularly interested in is early medieval history, which basically is the history from the fall of the Roman Empire to perhaps the 12th, 13th century, and particularly Anglo-Saxon and Viking history. So I have written about that. I co-wrote with my daughter a book called The Viking Blitzkrieg, AD 789 to 1098, another book called 1016 and 1066, Why the Vikings Caused the Norman Conquest, one called Norse Myths and Legends, and one called The Avon Valley Anglo-Saxon Frontier, which looked at the particular Avon that flows near us to Bristol. So yeah, I've got a big interest in a number of areas, but one of my areas, as I said, which I've co-written with my eldest daughter, who read Anglo-Saxon, Norse and Celtic at Cambridge, is that on early medieval history. So just the area that you're talking about. But of course they do cross over, because this is very much part of our deep story, that when we ourselves try to understand who we are, you in the northeast, me in Wessex, you in Northumbria, me in Wessex, that we very often do draw on those Anglo-Saxon terms and those Anglo-Saxon histories to explain who we are. So there are connections. So getting on with your question. Well, the conversion period. So we've got towards the end of the 6th century, we've got Catholic missionaries. Of course, there's only one church in the Western Roman Empire, sent to convert the kings of Kent, and then from there into Northumberland. We've got Augustine, and later on we've got people like Paulinus and so on engaged in these missionary activities. And so basically the 7th century, so from about 597 until 700, is a key time. By the end of that century, all the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, all those kingdoms that have been formed out of the wreckage of Roman Britain, these strange kingdoms often claimed that they were founded by people who'd come across the sea from Schleswig, Holstein, and northwestern Germany and Europe, and from southern Scandinavia, but who often, when we look at their details and their DNA, are clearly a strange mix, and lots in between. There's Irish mercenaries in there as well. But out of this kind of wreckage of the Roman Empire, in the 5th and 6th century, you've got a whole patchwork of little kingdoms form. We sometimes call them the heptarchy, but in fact there were many more than 7 of them, and they vary over time. Obviously, Northumbria was a powerhouse in the north, Wessex, Mercia, East Anglia, for example, and many others. But what we find is that from the 590s, they begin to convert to Christianity. And there's a whole range of factors that lead into that. I mean, obviously, as a Christian, I think there is something intriguingly attractive, intrinsically attractive about the gospel and about the promise of certainty and about the fact that you can have faith and know where you're going after death. And I have no doubt that that was also one of the major factors that drew people to the faith. I think sometimes we can overdo the kind of cost benefits analysis of this, and I think there was an intrinsic attractiveness to the faith at a time when there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of turbulence, and people perhaps looking for certainty in their lives. But the church offered other things as well. Many of these early kingdoms kind of regarded themselves as being little Romans, even as they were cutting up a slice out of the pie of the disintegrating Roman Empire and sort of destroying it. In many ways, they were kind of thinking that they were new little Roman emperors, and they took Roman titles for themselves. And I think converting to Christianity made them feel that they were part of Romanness. They were plugged into Romanitas, because obviously the late Roman Empire from the 4th century onward is officially Christian. So the empire they come into is a Christian empire, and converting gives them something of its Romanitas. They are becoming more Roman, and they see themselves very much in these lights. The church also offers them a whole lot of other advantages as well. It offers literate church people who will record history, who will record law codes, who will provide them with what we now call the civil service equivalent of their kingdom. And these things are also big attractions as well. So a whole range of reasons caused kingdoms, Kent, Northumbria, Wessex, East Anglia, eventually Mercia as well, a bit later Mercia in the Midlands, to convert to Christianity, because there are a whole bunch of benefits that come from it. Allying yourself with the superpower of the age. And the superpower of the age was not on this side of the Channel, it was on the other side of the Channel, in what we now call France, the Low Countries, Western Germany, and into northern Italy as well. And that is the Frankish Empire. And so the Frankish Empire is Christian, and so aligning yourself with the church and converting also gets you aligned with the superpower of the age. In the same way as in the 20th century, 21st century, there'll be countries that want to align themselves with America because of American culture, what American stands for, and the benefits of being an ally of America. Or at times, China, we live in a competitive world now. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms also saw themselves as plugging into the advantages of being allies of the Frankish kings as well, who were Christian. And in fact, the first Roman missionaries who came to this country came from Francia. But we should remember, of course, there was a British church that had been here for several centuries before this conversion, and that gets brought into, amalgamated, often doesn't get a lot of airtime or a lot of praise, I have to say, by these early English speakers. But the British church also is keeping the flame of Christianity alive in these islands. And of course, we have a huge input from the Irish church as well, Irish saints coming into Northumbria and further afield as well. So what we're talking about as an English conversion is one that's very much connected to the continent. It also has a great debt to the British church and to the Irish church as well. So it is a multicultural, multi-ethnic organization. Now, when people say, I'm pure English stock, that simply means they haven't studied English history. Because right back to the origins of England, it's a complex, multicultural, multi-ethnic community. There we go. Complex stuff, but exciting.
Brilliant. So, you mentioned the Catholic Church coming in and being quite, prominent in its missionary outlets, sending great bishops. One of the sees that Augustine founded was Canterbury, and still going on, and now is our main principal diocese, I suppose, in the Church of England. But of course, you mentioned the church that was here, and in this area, particularly the Celtic Church, was of real significance. I wonder whether you could touch on what some of the key differences were between this kind of Celtic Christianity and what they faced when the Roman Christianity came to this part of the world, and obviously the councils of Whitby changed things and all those sorts of
Mm.
things. But what might have been, would it be a little bit like a Methodist walking into a Roman Catholic church, or would it have been a more starker contrast? How would that have gone down to the normal people of the area?
That's a very, very good question, because, as I say,
Thank you.
although the the official mission is sent by Rome, Augustine, who's sent in 597, he arrives in Kent. He comes to a community that already is being influenced by Christianity, and as the north converts, so for example, as we see Paulinus working heavily in Northumbria, converting kings like Edwin of Northumbria, and carrying out these amazing missionary activities. So we need to remember that Northumbria looks north and east as well as south and west, and it's open to other influences too. And the other influences that it's open to come from what we now call southwest Scotland and come from Ireland, because Ireland had converted to Christianity, or the kingdoms of the Irish, it's a patchwork of kingdoms, had converted to Christianity, or was converting to Christianity earlier than the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. So a place like Northumbria, it's not unique within this, but it is very, very important within this, is very much in a crossroads. I say not unique because actually Irish missionaries turn up all over the place. They turn up near here at Malmesbury, for example, founding the monastery there. They turn up in East Anglia, but perhaps one might say supremely, they turn up in Northumbria. Northumbria looks both to what we sometimes call the Celtic Church, the Irish Church, as well as heavily influenced by the Roman Church. And that's helped by the fact that Northumbria is frequently torn apart by civil wars between two royal houses. One house is the house of Dyra, and basically that's a unit that's basically the Vale of York, approximating to sort of the Yorkshire area down towards the Humber. But the other big dynasty in Northumberland is the dynasty of Bernicia, with its great fortress at the Rock of Bamborough. And so basically Northumbria is created by a fusion of these two dynasties fighting amongst each other. One gets on top, then the other one gets on top. People flee into exile, when one lot's on top. And what we find is that princes of Northumbria flee, for example, to southwest Scotland, out of the range of its enemies, its English enemies in Northumbria, and there they are very influenced by the Ionan community. And Iona is a powerhouse of culture. It's not the only Celtic monastery in what we now call southern Scotland. Scotland doesn't exist at the time, but it's easier to talk about southern Scotland because you kind of know where I mean. But southern and southwest Scotland has already had a lot of Christian activity, and that's come from Ireland. Iona is a very important part of that. And when these young princes then come back and reassert their dynastic power in Northumbria, they bring that version of Christianity that they've become involved with, and that's the Ionan form of Christianity. Now, these Christians, they're all Christians, right? I mean, they're all Orthodox. They all subscribe to all the creeds. And sometimes nowadays we can kind of overstress the differences between them. But they tended to differ over things that really wound each other up at the time. So, for example, what we sometimes call the Celtic Church, and it would never have called itself the Celtic Church. It would never have called itself the Celtic Church. It was just the Christian church in that place, period. But it had been cut off from Rome, or from easy contact with Rome, by the disruption caused by the end of the Roman Empire. And many of the ways it dated things, like Easter, for example, and the great liturgical periods of the year, were out of sync with the latest liturgical and dating and church year organizing fashions in Rome. Now, you might think, well, that's just an inconvenience. You're celebrating Easter there and I'm celebrating Easter here. Well, actually, that could be quite disruptive in a Christian community. But not only that, how people get wound up about things that are not perhaps central to the faith. Well, these kind of things became a very, very big deal. So we actually see people accusing the other side of being heretics and so on. So in many ways, you might not have seen a great difference between them, but you would have noticed different ways in which they organised the church year, That was certainly different. You'll have also noticed the way in which, coming from non-urban environments, the so-called Celtic church tended to be based more on its monasteries. So abbots could be more powerful than bishops, for example. Whereas the Roman church, coming out of a more urban environment, I mean, it's all pretty relative. Urbanization had collapsed in England, what would become England, the end of the Roman Empire. But they came from Italy, they came from the Mediterranean, where bishops who were normally established in urban centres, they were the local powerhouse leaders of the church. And so different ways of structuring themselves existed, which, as I say, Celtic monasteries tended to be more the powerhouses, with abbots, for example, being very, very powerful, and bishops being perhaps less powerful in many areas, whereas the Roman church, you have much more of an episcopal model in that sense, with bishops normally based on royal centres where they could be urban. And as I say, urbanization had collapsed in Britain, but certainly in the Mediterranean, it's still a relatively urban culture. And so these differences become a real problem between them. And there's a real contest between, when push comes to shove, who's going to organise this? Who's going to decide? And as you rightly say, the Synod of Whitby finally sees the Northumbrian ruler decide in favour of the Roman Church. And we see a withdrawal from Northumbria of some very significant Celtic leadership. And eventually, the Celtic Church, as we call it, will actually come over to the Roman model as well, but it's going to take some time to do that. But there is a tussle, particularly in the 7th century and into the 8th century. There is a tussle between these two groups as to, when push comes to shove, who's going to decide these key issues. And eventually it's going to be the Roman Church that is going to succeed. And I guess if there are any major differences, the Celtic Church seems to have more of a reputation for aestheticism, encouraging, for example, the eremitic commitment of monasticism and solitary life. But then we find that in the Anglo-Saxon Church as well. So there'll be a lot of similarities, some significant differences, and the differences meant a lot to the people at the time, even though we might think that's nothing to fall out with over big time. People fell out over them big time in the 7th century and into the 8th century.
I suppose in 1300 years, people might look back on some of the disputes we're having in the church and probably think similarly. We all have our crosses to bear, don't we? So where did the Celtic Church find its authority? If it's this sort of offshoot, or sort of lost its way or separated from the rest of the church in some way. You mentioned bishops and abbots and things. Was there a central point of authority for them? Was that found in Ireland, or how did that work?
That's a very good question. I mean, they would have said, of course, that they were utterly rooted in the same apostolic authority as the Catholics who criticised them and said that they drifted and lost their way. And they just said, look, we've been doing this for centuries. Christianity is going to appear in this country, from the 2nd century onwards. Many of these churches, particularly in mainland Britain, will have roots that go right back into the Roman Empire. We know, for example, that there are bishops from Cirencester, Corinium, and from Londinium at councils towards the end of the Roman Empire in Roman Gaul. So these people, they don't regard themselves as lacking legitimacy in any way whatsoever. They would say, we have got the same apostolic authority as you have. We come under the Pope. We recognise the authority of St. Peter's in Rome. But because of the disruptions at the end of the Roman Empire, in many ways, whilst they were still very much connected to that world, and there is movement, we mustn't think of an island people that are totally disconnected from the continent. That's simply not true. There's a surprising amount of movement, even at this time of huge disruption, from the continent to Britain and back. Nevertheless, they've had this opportunity, this need, I suppose, to get on with developing their own structures. And in that way, some of their developments have kind of moved away from mainline developments that have been devised on the continent, under perhaps the more hands-on direction of the Pope. But they would have said same authority at Scripture, same apostolic authority. They recognise they come under the Pope. They wouldn't have contested any of that at all. These aren't like proto-Protestants or something. These are people who regard themselves as part of the worldwide, as they saw it, Catholic communion, but they developed ways of doing things that were kind of out of sync with the latest way of doing it. And the problem was, were they going to come on board and change for them, which were traditional ways of doing things, some of which had centuries behind them now. And it's not easy for people who have these traditions to say, well, okay, I'll stop doing all that now. I'll now do it in the newfangled way. But the people who are representing the new way are going to say, but this has the current authority of the Pope and you must fall in line. So it becomes an authority issue between them. And so for about a century, there is a real tension and conflict because they find it difficult to give up these ways that they've inherited from their ancestors, who are Christians too. But the people who are now having the main authority in the area, who are sent by the Pope to re-establish things and sort things out, say, well, I've got the latest mandate and I expect you to come under this. And there are real tensions. We know, for example, that when St. Augustine met the British bishops somewhere in the southern Cotswolds, not far from where I live now, there's real tension between them. And one of their holy men, one of the British bishops, said to the other bishops and abbots, if when you meet him at a place later called St. Augustine's Oak, somewhere in the southern Cotswolds, if he rises to greet you as a fellow brother, then we can work this out. But if he stays seated like a ruler and a monarch and expects you to come and accept his authority, then we got a problem. I'm slightly paraphrasing the Latin here, or the British. But they come, and St. Augustine sits there with the authority of the Pope on him, with these people who've got it wrong, and he stays seated, and he expects them to come and just basically come under his authority. And I think, sadly, some huge opportunities were lost there, and on some other subsequent occasions as well, by those who are representing the latest form of Christianity, who could have said to others, look, we honour what you're doing, we respect what you're doing, we know it's amazing what you've been up against, but actually this is a way that we now think is a better way of doing it. Let's work on this together. But that kind of compromise graciousness does seem to be a bit in short supply at times.
Yeah. So the Roman Church viewed then these, or what we would call the Celtic churches, valid and part of this group, but they just needed an update in many ways. It was sort of like when you put your PC on and you're about to write an important email, and then all of a sudden Windows says you need your update, and but obviously, like us, when the update comes, we don't want to change it. We don't want to. No. We just want to get on with what we're doing.
You're used to what you're using, yes. And of course, that's when it started to get nasty, because then when people were reluctant to change, when they were slow to change, when they said, "Well, actually, let's look at why we do things. We're not accepting the fact that we're wrong." That's when accusations of heretic gets thrown around, and you are actually rebelling against church authority, and that also has an unpleasant ethnic tone to it, because the English kingdoms have converted to the Catholic form, or the latest, they're all Catholics, but what you might call the Roman form, for want of a better label. The people they're fighting, who are the British kingdoms of the west of England and the north, and what would now become Wales, they are often Christians within, for want of a better label, the Celtic tradition. So there does get to be a nasty ethnic side to it as well. So, for example, at the Battle of Bangor on Dee near Chester, when the British soldiers, are defeated by the warriors on the English side, the warriors on the English side slaughter all the British monks that they capture. because they say, well,
Right.
basically, you were praying for your king, they lost. You've taken up arms against us. We're going to slaughter you. And not only that, and I think Bede records this, he basically says, well, basically, they had nobody to blame it themselves, did they? And Bede actually is very dismissive of the British church. He praises the Irish church. He has quite a lot of time for the Irish branch of Celtic Christianity, who he's very indebted to in Northumberland, and with whom he doesn't have the same sort of ethnic tensions because the English kingdoms are not at war with the Irish kingdoms, but he has very little respect for the British branch of the Celtic Church because they are in cahoots, as far as he can see it, with the British, who don't accept the fact that God's given the new mandate to the English speakers. So you do get some unpleasant ethnicity here, but basically saying, we're the Roman Church, God's on our side because we're the English who are beating you lot, and you lot, God's decided against you, the British Church, and your British rulers, and you just better just come quietly or go away. But Bede is much more respectful towards the Irish church because there isn't the same political competition with the Irish church. He disapproves of them. He thinks they've got it wrong, but he's much more gentle with them. But British Christians, he can be very dismissive of, and that's quite common to a lot of early Anglo-Saxon Christian converts. They can be very dismissive towards the defeated British church because they think God's decided in favour of them, the English, and they've chosen for Rome, and the British are still hanging on to these outmoded methods. So there are some very strange things going on here at a whole bunch of different levels in terms of faith, in terms of tradition, in terms of historicity, in terms of ethnic tension, in terms of racism as well. So it really is an extraordinarily complex mix going on, particularly in the 7th and the 8th century.
So then, with all of that in mind, there's an awful lot to bear in mind of the complexities of the age. Obviously, we're celebrating Petertide turning 1,350 years old,
Wow.
of being an almost continual place of worship. There's a brief period where the Vikings got rid of us slightly, but it came back, and the monastery was rebuilt and fell into it's now a parish church, not a monastery, and the remnants are gone. But thinking about monastic life for a moment and these abbots that kind of powerful and the rest of it. Monk Wearmouth with Jarrow is the only twin monastery in the world, as far as we're aware. Michelle Brown, when she came, gave a lecture, spoke quite a lot on that. But what was the effect of these monasteries on their local area? What would have Monk Wearmouth brought to the people of what we now call Sunderland? How did it change their lives?
These monastic communities, of course, in some places of men, in some places of women, in some places early on, double monasteries of men and women, separate, but sort of in related communities, were cultural, spiritual, political, and economic powerhouses. They were really, really crucial because when kings and queens granted land to the church for the founding of these monastic institutions, they basically created places which were, as well as carrying out the regular office of monastic communities, they were praying for the rulers. They were also producing documents. So, things like Lindisfarne Gospels, for example. I mean, these are being produced at these extraordinary scriptoria. So these are centers of learning. If people want to be educated, they're going to go to monasteries. Now, the vast majority of people can't read and write, but those who can read and can write will be able to do so because they have been trained within the monastic community. And in fact, we need to remember, of course, that the church has oversight of education right through to the Reformation, and that basically anybody who has education is going to be at the very least a clerk in minor orders, right through to the Reformation in the 16th century. But these early churches are powerhouses of education. They're powerhouses of art, of sculpture, of painting. They are economic powerhouses as well, because Whereas a secular land holding might get disrupted, might get divided between heirs, might pass from family to family, might revert to the king or the queen, and particularly the king, and then be granted out again. When this land is granted to monasteries, it's granted in perpetuity. So that means that an enterprising community of monks and nuns can think, well, we can improve this area here, and they have the money to do it, they have the resources to do it, and they have the time to do it. And if they don't finish it, the next generation is going to take it on. So there's a big debate at the moment about which comes first. The appearance of towns, or the reappearance of towns in Britain after the Roman Empire, or the appearance of monastic communities. And there is a strong argument that says that actually it's monastic communities that come first. That although you've got the ruins of Roman towns, and you've got this memory of places like Eberacum at York, and so on and so forth, Londinium and so on, that actually these places are in ruins. But what actually happens is the church effectively creates little settlements which are economic powerhouses, which are governmental powerhouses, which can be used to organise the area. And there is one argument that the revival of town economy in the 7th century owes more to the location of churches and minsters and monasteries, and not the other way around. That actually it's these Christian communities that actually have the expertise in stone buildings, for example, and in literacy, that actually provide these core areas, which themselves will then become the places where kings will grant land to other people to found towns and so on, where mints will eventually be and where taxes will be paid and so on and so forth. So these places are real powerhouses in their community. And there'll be great landowners, so large numbers of people in the area will actually be taking their tithes and their other products to these churches. Their landlord will be the abbot, later on the bishop, and so on and so forth. So they are major land owners. In fact, one of the things that Bede starts to get anxious about, and so do some other writers, is that too much royal land is being granted away. Because if you haven't got some land back to grant to the next generation of warriors and so on, how are you going to keep the defense of the kingdom going? So there really is quite a dynamic process of land being granted to the church, and then the church developing it, and it not going back into royal hands for some time, if at all, because of course the church holds it in perpetuity. They're very important.
So that they played a spiritual, but then also, I suppose, a political role in the day.
Yep.
So let's skip forward a few years, maybe a few sort of decades. Monk Wearmouth has been established now for a number of years. The monks have lived there. The things that we know is one of the largest monastic libraries. Had one of the greatest scriptoriums, the codex that was produced there, and sadly Ceolfrith died on his way to deliver one of those to the Pope. We got stained glass. We've got all these things that you've just spoken about: the beauty, the history, the learning, the arts, and the crafts. And then there's a knock at the door. And the knock at the door is, give us all your money, and we're going to burn your idols, and we're going to burn your God, and the Vikings have arrived. How did that go down? How was that? Where did they land first? I know we're sort of widening the scope from Monk Wearmouth now, but did they hit the north first, or was it the south?
The most famous raid, the one that gets all the airtime, is the 793 raid on Lindisfarne, which caused absolute devastation, caused real problems, and shockwaves go right across Western Europe. That this powerhouse, this cultural powerhouse, wherein the Lindisfarne Gospels had been produced early in the century, has been wrecked. But interesting enough, the very first recorded raid is not in the north; it's in Dorset. On Purbeck in 789. So the very, very first raid happens on Portland in Dorset in 789, but within a short period of time in 793 we've got the most devastating recorded early raid, which is that on Lindisfarne. And what we have over the next century is escalating raids coming out of Scandinavia. Now, this is before the unified kingdoms, states of Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and so on. And a whole bunch of push and pull factors are causing this explosion of raids out of Scandinavia. We know, for example, that there have been changes in the Middle East that have cut Scandinavia off from Islamic silver, changes in the caliphate that has caused a shift from Damascus to Baghdad, actually disrupts northern trade. And so Scandinavia suddenly finds that its supply of silver, it takes in silver from Islamic traders, and it sends slaves and amber and all sorts of things to the south. That's been disrupted. So people in Scandinavia now have to look elsewhere for their silver, for their precious metals that they want as part of their cultural gift giving, for example, and the funding of their society. They look to the kingdoms of Western Europe, where they're going to take and steal, which they'll be familiar with, because Scandinavians will have been coming down into the North Sea, coming down into the English Channel for generations and generations. But we now see is an explosion of raiding. At the same time, the Christian Frankish kingdom is pushing at southern, what we now call Denmark. So there is something of a clash of civilizations going on as well, with an aggressive Christian kingdom, the Empire of the Franks, pushing at southern Scandinavia, and pagan Scandinavia pushing back as well. So you've got a number of different factors going on here. And what it results in is, from basically the middle of the 8th century onwards, we see increasing raids by ever larger parties of young men, mostly. There are some women too, some debate about that, but certainly, testosterone fueled raids of people that go stealing, taking, and then taking it back to Scandinavia. These are the Norse. Technically, Viking was something you did rather than something that you were, but nowadays we use the term Viking to cover the whole thing. And this escalates until by the middle of the 9th century, so from 850s onwards, these increasingly large armies begin to realize that they can actually stay, they can actually carve out kingdoms, and they begin to knock down the kingdoms of Eastern Mercia, and they put Wessex under severe pressure as well. It alone survives of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. And what they bring is devastation, they bring destruction, they completely upend the apple cart, of course. And what happens in the north of England is that they found that new kingdoms. So, for example, Viking kings, Norse kings established themselves in York, what they call Jorvik speakers. They found a Norse kingdom which is allied to the kingdom of Dublin, for example. So the geopolitics of Britain is completely upended. The only Anglo-Saxon kingdom that survives is Wessex in the south, and it leads a fight back over the next century or so, until in the end, from 954, basically the kings of Wessex are now the kings of the whole of what we now call England again. But in the north, there's huge disruption. But it's not just destruction as well, because rapidly people begin to adjust to the new political realpolitics. And actually, if you're in the north of England and you've now got a king sitting in York, for example, then in fact, actually, well, you come to terms with that. He may be a pagan king, but actually you come to terms with working with him, because the kings from the south, well, Winchester's a very, very long way away. And anyway, the West Saxons are traditional enemies anyway. So, you don't sort of see them necessarily as being your compatriots from the south. They're the southerners who have been your traditional enemies anyway. So a whole new realpolitik emerges in the north based on York. But what's interesting is around Bamborough, for example, you've got an Anglo-Saxon holdout where the High Reeves of Bamborough basically rule like kings, a bit like the stewards of Gondor do in Lord of the Rings, after the rest of the community has collapsed and fallen, and they're going to be there right till the very end. So local people have to make decisions, and it's quite clear that local church leaders do the same thing as well. They soon accommodate themselves to the new arrivals. They clearly try to encourage conversion amongst the new arrivals, and within a generation or so, within 2 generations, most of the arrivals have converted to Christianity. So what you've now got is a Norse speaking or an Anglo-Saxon Norse-speaking community in the north and northeast of the country, where many people have accommodated to that, and they regard kings from the south as being something of a problem. And the church becomes a very important part of that. We see, for example, some strange legends of St Cuthbert, or his relics, and those guarding it, being called in to adjudicate in Norse Viking dynastic disputes who should be king. So clearly the Norse themselves, after this terribly destructive 100 years or so, begin to accommodate themselves to the new environment, and they're quite chameleon. They take on board lots of the attributes of the places they then conquered. The people who are the power brokers in the nations that they conquer adjust to the new reality, and what happens in the end is the formation of what you might call an Anglo-Norse North, particularly an Anglo-Norse northeast and eventually northwest as well, which then eventually gets brought back into the emerging Kingdom of England, but often not willingly at all. And it's not till 954, the last King of York, a man called Eric Bloodaxe, who I should add was not called that because he was good with the children, is finally killed at the Battle of Stainmore. And so until 954, people in the north have their own separate kingdom, and it's a Norse kingdom, but it's a hybrid Anglo-Saxon Norse kingdom that they've all come to terms with. So we mustn't think of the Vikings as being continually destructive. There is a very, very destructive, perhaps century and a bit more than that. But after that, they begin to set up their own structures in this country, and the north of England is a Norse power base.
So it's sort of, I suppose, within a generation or two, the next generation adapts, picks up some of the cultural trends. They've maybe not spent as much time in their homelands as the parents who have conquered, and almost an assimilation takes place.
Yes.
So during this time, what would have been, or what was... What's the question here? How did the church respond initially? And was there a great, we watch programs like Vikings on Amazon, and it's almost as if it looks as if the Vikings have wiped the church out. That sounds as if that wasn't the reality. And we know, as you said, that Viking kings become Christians and take that back to their homelands as well. So what was that initial response? The Vikings landed, they've knocked at the door, they've sacked and burnt and destroyed a number of monasteries, but how do you be missional when someone's trying to burn your front door down?
Yeah, exactly. So to start with, it's terrible, and so we get all our early records are from monastic sources, and clearly, understandably, they think this is terrible. These people have come and they've destroyed, they've killed, they've murdered, they've enslaved, and it really is really bad. And I think some people say, "Oh yeah, the monks would say that, wouldn't they?" Yeah, they would say that, wouldn't they? If someone had just come and trashed their monastery, nicked everything, taken their friends hostage or slaves, and burnt the place down, I think that's wholly understandable, to be frank. So I think some people can be a bit kind of like, oh, that's very much a monastic view of things. Yeah. If you'd been there for the first generation, I think you might have subscribed to the monastic view of things too. I mean, the Vikings were not PC. The Vikings came as violent, brutal raiders, and they caused terrible, terrible destruction. But the church clearly, and we don't know as much about this as we'd like to know, but the church clearly soon begins to offer its services in political situations. And clearly the very fact that monks are drawn in at times to sort Viking disputes suggests that there must have been, below the radar, a lot more negotiating going on once the initial raiding and destruction had stopped, and once the settlement and the formation of kingdoms was taking place. Now, the missionary thing is really, really interesting because we know very, very little about what you might call direct missionary activity to the newcomers. And I like to think that the fact that within a century, within a generation or two, that most of them had converted Christianity, I like to think was due to the witness, the activity, and the presence of their neighbours who were Christian and who had something about them, so about their culture, the way of doing things, that was attractive. And it may well have been that there was something of, Romanness, if you like, something of civilization, something like, well, actually, now we've conquered it, we want to be a king like your old kings were, and we want literacy, and we want law codes, we want that sort of stuff, and you can provide that for us. But I like to think it also was something about the quiet witness of people who just got on with being Christians, who actually helped the conversion of the North alongside what you might call more official missionary activity. Because my reading of it suggests that there isn't as much record for what you might call missionary activity officially by the church, but yet nevertheless, within a generation or two, they convert. And I think that tells you something about the interaction with their neighbours. And if I had a time machine, that's a period of time I'd love to go back to the East Midlands, to the North, and see what was going on and see what it was that was driving that conversion. Because it wasn't some great missionary activity being sent up from Wessex or being sent from the Pope in Rome. Something else was going on, local and small scale. But whatever it was, by the 950s, certainly by the 990s, most of those people who are the descendants of the original arrivals from Scandinavia have converted to Christianity. And although at times it's a bit of a hybrid pagan Christianity at times, nevertheless, in the end, it will become clearly recognizably Christian. Something's going on, and I'd like to find out what. And I think it's happening at the grassroots. And until I'm proved otherwise, that's what I'm going to keep on saying. It's grassroots Christians who are making the change. If any other evidence emerges, I'd like to know.
Brilliant. Well, I think that's a cracking place, maybe to bring this to a bit of a conclusion. I think you've really hit the nail on the head. It's the people that make up the church,
Yep.
The grassroots. Sorry, my dog just. You can probably hear the dog sneezing. He's having a bit of a sneezing kind of session going on down there on the floor. For any of those, it's not us. It's the Labrador.
Yes, I'm glad you pointed that out. I'm glad you pointed that out.
We have our own sound effects department. It's just not very on cue. What was it I was saying? It's the grassroots. It's the people. It's the you and I's. Well, maybe not I's with the collars, but it's the everybody, the every man, the every person who, by living out their faith publicly, I suppose, in a very dangerous place to do it as well.
Absolutely.
Pagan Britain.
Yeah, it's all about the ecclesia. It's about the community.
Yeah. It wasn't a safe place to be a Christian, or just to live anyway. Generally, you got a society that's being worked out on who's the strongest and who can conquer. To live that way and to be that way must have been a real witness. They're probably fed up of killing Christians, so they just decided to become one instead, solve the problem.
Well, certainly they converted pretty quickly. Something was going on.
Something was going on. Well, Martyn, thank you ever so much for your time and for your infinite knowledge on this subject. I'm sure we could have gone on for many, 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 many more hours. But I think we've hit the key points there. And thank you, everyone, for watching. And see you in the next one.
Take care. God bless. Thanks for having me.
Bye.